What if I told you the city you're walking through right now isn't the real one? Beneath your feet right now, there are streets, buildings, even entire neighborhoods, perfectly preserved in darkness. Not ancient ruins, not myths, real places. Built, used, and then buried. In Seattle, there's a whole city, one story below the one you see. In Portland, tunnels whisper stories of people who went in and never came back. In Cincinnati, a subway system was completed and then abandoned before a single passenger ever stepped inside. No war, no collapse, no disaster big enough to justify it. Just a decision to seal it all away. So the real question isn't what's down there. It's this. Why did they bury it? And why does no one talk about it? Most people never look down. They walk, they scroll, they move from one place to another, eyes fixed on what's in front of them, traffic lights, storefronts, reflections in glass. Cities feel solid, finished, permanent. But they're not, because in some American cities, the ground you're standing on isn't the original ground at all. It's a cover. In Seattle, if you walk through Pioneer Square and pay close attention, you might notice something strange beneath your feet, small squares of glass embedded in the sidewalk. Most people assume they're decorative, maybe skylights for basements. They're not. Those pieces of glass are windows, and they don't look into basements. They look into another city. One level below the street you see today, there are sidewalks, storefronts, entire passages frozen in time. Wooden beams, brick walls, doorways that once opened into businesses full of people. A city that didn't decay, a city that didn't collapse, a city that was simply left behind. At first, this sounds like an urban legend, the kind of story you hear on late-night forums or conspiracy videos, hidden tunnels, secret worlds, forgotten history. But this one is different, because you can visit it. Guided tours will take you down there. You can walk through those old streets yourself. You can touch the walls, see the layouts, stand where people once stood, when that level was the actual city. And that's when the question hits you. If this was once the real Seattle, why is it underground now? The official answer is simple, practical, clean. Too clean. They'll tell you the city had problems, flooding, poor drainage, sewage issues. Seattle was built on low, muddy land near tidal flats. Water would rise, streets would turn into sludge, waste had nowhere to go. So the solution, they say, was engineering. Raise the streets, fix the system, modernize the city. That's the explanation. And, on the surface, it makes sense. But something about it doesn't sit right. Because cities don't usually solve problems by burying themselves. They rebuild, they reinforce, they redesign. They don't take entire districts fully built, fully functional, and just to leave them underneath. Not without a fight. Not without resistance. Not without records that make it all feel justified. And yet, in Seattle, it happened. Fast. Almost too fast. Within a few years, a complete transformation took place. Streets moved upward. Buildings adapted. The old ground level became obsolete. Then it became invisible. Then it became forgotten. But Seattle isn't the only place. Once you notice this pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. Portland has tunnels beneath its streets, real tunnels, confirmed but no clear agreement on what they were actually used for. Cincinnati built an entire subway system, miles of tunnels, fully constructed stations, ready to operate. It never opened. Not once. New York, arguably the most developed transit system in the country, has abandoned stations, sealed platforms, even a luxury station beneath City Hall that looks more like a cathedral than infrastructure. Closed, hidden, preserved. Los Angeles once had underground transit lines and tunnel networks connecting parts of the city long before cars took over. Now most of it is sealed off, ignored, disconnected from the version of the city people recognize. Different cities, different reasons, but the same outcome. Something was built, something was used, and then quietly it was pushed out of sight. At first, you might think it's coincidence. Urban evolution, changing technology, economic shifts. Each case has its own explanation. Each one sounds reasonable on its own. But when you line them up side by side, a pattern starts to emerge. Between the late 1800s and the mid-1900s, American cities didn't just grow. They replaced themselves, layer by layer. The old version didn't disappear. It was buried. And here's the part that should bother you. Not that these places exist, but how easily they were forgotten. Entire streets gone from memory. Massive infrastructure never used. Architectural spaces sealed away like they never mattered. All within a single lifetime. No ancient history. No lost civilizations. Just decisions. So now, every time you walk through a city, any city, you have to wonder, what's underneath this street? What used to be here before this version existed? And more importantly, what else has been buried that we were never meant to see? Because once you realize the surface isn't the full story, you can't unsee it. And that's where this story really begins. It didn't start as a disaster. It started as a mistake. June 6th, 1889. A normal afternoon in Seattle. Inside a small woodworking shop at the corner of Front and Madison, a young apprentice was heating glue over a stove. Thick, sticky adhesive common for the time. Routine work. Nothing unusual. Until he knocked it over. The hot glue spilled onto the floor. And the floor wasn't clean. It was covered in wood shavings, sawdust, dry scraps, the kind that ignite faster than paper. Within seconds, the fire caught. Within minutes, it spread. The flames moved like they were alive. From the workshop to the building next door. From there to a liquor store. Then everything escalated. The liquor store exploded. Fire jumped across the street, feeding on wooden structures packed tightly together. Another explosion. Then another 2 saloons gone in seconds. Seattle, at that time, was a city built almost entirely of wood, which meant one thing. Once the fire started, it wasn't stopping. And then came the worst part. The city wasn't ready. The fire chief? Out of town. No centralized command. No coordination. Volunteers rushed in, trying to help, dragging hoses into position, but they made a critical mistake. They connected too many hoses at once. Water pressure dropped, almost to zero. Imagine standing there, watching your city burn, holding a hose that barely drips. By nightfall, the fire had consumed block after block. By morning, it was over. But not because anyone stopped it, because there was nothing left to burn. When the smoke cleared, Seattle wasn't damaged. It was erased. Somewhere between 25 and 30 city blocks gone, reduced to ash. Businesses, streets, livelihoods, wiped out in less than a day. The estimated loss? $20 millions in 1889. A staggering amount equivalent to hundreds of millions today. At this point, the story should be familiar. A city destroyed. A tragédie. A rebuilding effort. That's how these stories usually go. But Seattle didn't follow the usual script. Because what happened next wasn't just rebuilding. It was transformation. Within days, not months, the city's leaders made a decision. Not to restore Seattle. Not to rebuild it the way it was. But to change its geography entirely. They decided to raise the streets. Not by inches. Not by a small adjustment. By 12 feet. An entire story higher. Officially, the reasoning was practical. Seattle had always struggled with flooding. Built on tidal flats, the ground was unstable. Water would seep into streets. Sewage wouldn't drain properly. Every heavy rain turned parts of the city into a swamp. Raising the streets would fix all of that. Permanent solution. Clean slate. That's what they said. And again, on paper, it makes sense. You have a disaster. You take the opportunity to fix deeper problems. You rebuild smarter, stronger, higher. But there's something about the timing, the speed, the certainty. Because this wasn't a long debate, there was no prolonged planning phase, no visible hesitation. Just a rapid decision to fundamentally alter the city in a way that would bury everything that came before it. And here's where it gets even stranger. They didn't wait. Normally, if you're going to raise an entire city, you prepare the ground first. You build the new infrastructure. Then you construct buildings on top of it. That would be logical. That would be controlled. That would make sense. Seattle didn't do that. Property owners, eager, desperate to recover their losses, started rebuilding immediately. On the old ground level, right where their buildings had burned down. Same locations, same foundations. Even though they knew something crucial, that ground level was about to disappear. They knew their new first floors would eventually become basements. And they built anyway. For a brief moment in time, Seattle became something impossible. A city in between. New buildings rising from the ashes. Old ground still in use. And above it all, construction crews slowly lifting the streets higher and higher. It created a bizarre, unstable reality. Sidewalks didn't line up with entrances. Doors opened into walls. People had to climb ladders just to enter shops. Imagine walking down a street. and needing to climb up or down just to reach the door beside you. This wasn't a planned city. This was improvisation on a massive scale, and yet it continued, because there was no turning back. Every day, the gap between the old city and the new one grew wider. Wooden retaining walls were built, earth was filled in, streets rose, and slowly, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, Seattle began to split into two, the city above and the city below. Most people at the time probably thought this was temporary, a phase, a transition, something that would eventually stabilize and settle. But they were wrong, because what started as a solution was about to become something else entirely, something permanent, something no one would talk about later. A city, sealed beneath another. And once that process was complete, there would be no going back, because you can rebuild a city, you can repair it, you can redesign it. But once you bury it, you're making a different kind of decision, not to fix the past, but to erase it. For a while, Seattle didn't make sense. It wasn't one city anymore, it was two. Above ground, construction crews kept raising the streets layer by layer, wall by wall. Dirt, debris, and engineering turned into elevation. What used to be street level was slowly sinking, not physically but in relevance. Below, life didn't stop. Shops reopened, businesses ran, people adapted, but nothing lined up anymore. Imagine walking into a store where the entrance is suddenly 10 feet below the sidewalk, or climbing a ladder just to step outside. That was normal. Doors opened into empty air, sidewalks hovered above entrances. Temporary staircases connected two worlds that weren't supposed to exist at the same time. Seattle became a construction site, but also a functioning city trapped inside it. For years, people lived like this. Not days, not weeks, years. Bridges were built between buildings. Wooden walkways stretched across gaps. Some streets had two levels of movement, one above, one below, both active, both real. From a distance, it looked like progress. Up close, it felt unstable, improvised, unnatural, and yet no one stopped it. Because by then, the decision had already been made. The city wasn't going back to the way it was. It was moving upward, no matter what it left behind. Eventually, the upper level won. It had cleaner streets, better drainage, more space, more light. The lower level, the original Seattle, became inconvenient, then unnecessary, then invisible. By the mid-1890s, the transition was nearly complete. Businesses moved upstairs, signs changed, entrances shifted. The official ground floor was no longer where it used to be. It was above it, and the old city? It didn't collapse. It didn't get demolished. It just stopped being used. To make things less disturbing, less final, the city installed something unusual. Glass panels in the sidewalks. Vault lights. They allowed sunlight to pass through, illuminating the spaces below. At first glance, it seemed thoughtful, practical, a way to keep the underground usable. But think about what that really means. They didn't destroy the old city. They preserved it, just enough to see it, not enough to live in it. For a short time, people still used those underground spaces, walking through dim corridors lit by filtered sunlight, passing by old storefronts that still stood where they'd always been. But something had changed. The energy was gone. The purpose was gone. The city below had become a shadow of itself. Then came 1907, and with it, the final decision. 3 people died from the bubonic plague. That was enough. Authorities declared the entire underground area unsafe. Rats, disease, contamination, the risks were too high. The order was clear. Shut it down. Seal it off. No more access. Officially, it was about public health. Unofficially, it was the moment the old Seattle was erased. Entrances were closed. Stairways removed. Access points blocked. The city below wasn't repurposed. It wasn't renovated. It wasn't even acknowledged. It was simply abandoned. And that's the part that doesn't feel right. Because cities don't usually abandon entire districts. Not ones that are structurally intact. Not ones that were still standing, still accessible, still usable. They redevelop them. They renovate them. They find a new purpose. But Seattle didn't. It chose to leave everything exactly where it was. To let it sit in darkness. To pretend it no longer mattered. And over time, people forgot. New generations grew up, never knowing there had been another city beneath their feet. Maps didn't show it. Records barely mentioned it. It faded not physically, but mentally. until all that remained were fragments, stories, and those small squares of glass in the sidewalk. But here's the thing. When you bury something, it doesn't disappear. It just waits. Because the underground didn't stay empty. It couldn't. Too many tunnels. Too many hidden spaces. Too many ways in, for people who knew where to look. And slowly, quietly, the city below began to change. Not back into what it was, but into something else. Something darker. Something that thrived specifically because it was hidden. The official Seattle was now above ground. Clean, structured, visible. But beneath it, another version of the city was forming. One without rules, without oversight, without light. A city that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. And yet, it did. Because once you create a hidden space that large, you don't control what fills it next. You just stop seeing it. And that's exactly what happened. Seattle didn't just build a new city. It created a void beneath it. And nature and human behavior have a way of filling voids. No matter what you intended, no matter what you tried to bury, the surface moved on. The city above evolved, modernized, expanded. But below, something was waking up. And it wasn't the Seattle anyone remembered. Once the doors were closed, they never reopened. After 1907, Seattle's underground wasn't just abandoned. It was officially erased. No access, no purpose, no acknowledgement. The entrances were blocked off, stairways removed, passages sealed behind brick, concrete, and time. On paper, it no longer existed. But reality doesn't work like paperwork. Because what they sealed wasn't empty space. It was an entire network. Miles of corridors, former streets, rooms, hidden connections between buildings. A complete structure intact, stable, and now invisible. And that created something dangerous. Not because of what it was, but because of what it became. At street level, Seattle continued to grow. New businesses opened, new roads expanded, the city modernized. People moved forward. They forgot. But below them, nothing changed. The old storefronts stayed where they were. The walls held their shape. The layout of the city, frozen in time, remained untouched. No sunlight, no noise, no movement, just silence. Until that silence was broken. Because abandoned space doesn't stay abandoned for long. Not in a city. It started quietly. People found their way in. Workers, locals, drifters, anyone who knew where to look or didn't mind breaking through what had been sealed. At first, it was curiosity. Exploration. Then it became opportunity. The underground offered something rare. Privacy. No police patrols. No regulations. No visibility. You could move through it unseen. And once people realized that, everything changed. During Prohibition, when alcohol was banned across the United States, Seattle's underground became active again. Not officially, not legally, but undeniably. Speakeasies opened in the darkness. Hidden bars, serving illegal alcohol beneath a city that pretended they didn't exist. You could enter through a legitimate business upstairs and disappear below within seconds. No street exposure, no witnesses, just tunnels. And it didn't stop there. Gambling operations moved in. Backroom deals, cards, cash, transactions that never needed records. The underground wasn't just hidden. It was protected by invisibility. Then came the opium dens. Low-lit rooms, narrow corridors, people slipping in and out without names, without questions. The kind of places that couldn't exist above ground, but thrived below it. And for those with nowhere else to go, the underground became shelter. Flowhouses formed in abandoned spaces. The homeless moved in, using what remained of the old city as protection from the one above. It wasn't safe. It wasn't clean. But it was hidden. And sometimes, that was enough. What Seattle had created, without intending to, was a second city. Not the one it buried, but a new one. A shadow version. Above ground, order, law, visibility. Below ground, anonymity, survival, and crime. Two realities, stacked on top of each other. One acknowledged, one denied. And the most unsettling part, they coexisted. For years, people walked over illegal operations every single day, without knowing. They stood above hidden rooms filled with activity, deals, lives unfolding in complete secrecy. The distance between the two worlds, just a few feet of dirt and concrete. That's all it takes. Eventually, parts of the underground were rediscovered. Not by authorities trying to shut it down, but by historians, In 1965, a local historian named Bill Speidel began exploring the buried city. He saw something different, not danger, not decay, but history, preserved, authentic, untouched. He started offering tours. Limited at first, controlled, just small sections made safe enough for the public. For the first time in decades, people went back down, and what they found was unsettling. Not because it was destroyed, but because it wasn't. The city below was still there. Walls intact, structures standing, layout unchanged, like someone had paused time and never pressed play again. But here's what most people don't realize. Those tours only show a fraction, a small, curated portion, cleaned up, reinforced, safe. The majority of Seattle's underground, still sealed, still inaccessible, still there. And that raises a question no one really answers. If the official reason for sealing it was safety, if the goal was to eliminate risk, then why leave so much of it intact? Why not demolish it completely? Why not fill it in? Why preserve a structure you claim is dangerous? Because preservation wasn't the goal. Erasure was. Out of sight, out of mind. Seattle didn't destroy its past. It hid it. And over time, the narrative changed. The underground became a curiosity, a tourist attraction, a historical footnote, something interesting but not important. But that framing misses the point. This wasn't a ruin discovered centuries later. This was a functioning part of the city that was deliberately removed from reality. And once you understand that, Seattle stops being an isolated case. Because when you look at other cities, you start seeing the same pattern. Different events, different explanations, but the same result. Something built, something used, something buried, and always something forgotten. Which brings us to Portland, a city with tunnels that definitely exist, a history of disappearances that's been documented, and a story so contested, no one can agree on what really happened down there. But the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to believe it was all just coincidence. Seattle was buried. Portland is something else. Because in Portland, the underground wasn't created by a single disaster. It grew quietly, piece by piece. And to this day, no one can fully agree on what it was actually used for. What we do know is simple. The tunnels exist. Beneath Old Town and Chinatown, there's a network of passages connecting basements of bars, hotels, and businesses, brick-lined corridors, narrow routes, hidden access points. You can walk parts of them today. They're real. That's not up for debate. What is debated is what happened inside them. To understand that, you have to go back to the late 1800s. At the time, Portland wasn't just a city. It was a port, a dangerous one. Ships arrived constantly from across the Pacific. Months at sea, harsh conditions, exhausted crews. And when those ships docked, many sailors didn't want to leave again. They disappeared. Not metaphorically, literally. Some would desert, slip away into the city, choosing uncertainty over another brutal voyage. That created a problem. Captains needed crews, desperately. And where there's desperation, there's opportunity. A practice emerged. It was called Shanghaiing. The idea was simple. You find a man, you get him drunk, or drug him, and then you sell him. By the time he wakes up, he's already at sea. No way back. No choice but to work. Or D. This wasn't a rumor. It's documented history. Shanghaiing happened. But here's where the story splits. According to local legend, Portland had perfected the system. Not on the streets, but underground. The story goes like this. You're in a bar. You have a drink, maybe two. You don't notice anything unusual. Then suddenly, the floor beneath you opens. A trap door. You fall. Not far enough to die, just far enough to disappear. Below you, tunnels. Dark. Confusing. Controlled. You're dragged through corridors no one above can see. Moved quickly. Silently. And by the time anyone realizes you're gone, you're already on a ship. No witnesses. No evidence. No trace. That's the story. And it's been told for decades. But here's the problem. Historians don't agree. The Oregon Historical Society has stated clearly, there is no solid evidence that these tunnels were used for systematic kidnapping. No confirmed trapdoors. No verified holding cells. And there's more. The harbor wall, the structure that would make direct tunnel access to ships possible, wasn't even completed until 1929, which means, before that, many of these tunnels would have flooded regularly. So the official position is simple. Shanghaiing happened, but it happened above ground, in bars, on streets, not in tunnels. And yet, the tunnels still exist. They connect buildings. They allow movement without being seen. They create hidden pathways beneath a city that, at the time, was filled with vulnerable targets. Even if they weren't used exactly as the stories describe, they were used. For what? That's where things get uncomfortable. There's evidence they were used for transporting goods during bad weather, moving alcohol during prohibition, running opium dens, avoiding law enforcement. All of that is acknowledged. But notice the pattern. Every time the underground comes up, the same structure appears in the explanation. Yes, it exists, but not like that. Yes, illegal things happened, but not in the tunnels. Yes, the tunnels were used, but only for harmless purposes. It's always partial acknowledgement, followed by limitation, never a full picture, and that creates a strange effect. Something physical, something you can walk through, touch, explore, becomes uncertain. You start questioning what you're seeing. Are these just storage basements? Or something more organized? Were they built for convenience? Or for control? Because tunnels change how a city works. They allow movement without visibility. They create alternative routes. They disconnect action from observation. And in a place like Portland, in a time when people were disappearing, that matters. Even if the most extreme stories aren't fully true, they didn't come from nowhere. Legends don't appear in a vacuum. They grow from something real, distorted, exaggerated, but rooted in fact. So maybe there weren't trapdoors in every bar. Maybe people weren't dropped into tunnels as often as the stories claim. But something was happening. Because you don't build connections like that, between buildings, across blocks, beneath a city, for no reason. And you don't keep them hidden, unless there's a reason to hide them. Portland isn't as clean-cut as Seattle. There was no single event. No fire, no clear decision. Just layers of activity. Some documented, some denied, some left in the gray area between. And that gray area is where the truth usually sits. Because when history becomes inconvenient, it doesn't disappear. It gets rewritten. And the tunnels remain, silent, waiting, still there beneath the city, whether the official story accepts them or not. But if Portland is about confusion, about blurred lines and disputed truth, then Cincinnati is something else entirely. Because Cincinnati didn't hide its underground. It built it, on purpose, finished it, and then walked away from it, without ever using it. Which raises a different kind of question. Not what happened down there, but why build something so massive, just to abandon it? Most underground stories begin with secrets. Cincinnati doesn't, because Cincinnati didn't hide its underground. It announced it, voted for it, funded it, built it, and then abandoned it. In 1916, the people of Cincinnati made a decision, not a quiet one, not a divided one. Over 80% of voters approved a plan to build a subway system, a full-scale modern rapid transit network, 16 miles of track, connecting downtown to surrounding neighborhoods. At the time, this was ambitious, but not unrealistic. Cities like New York and Boston already had underground transit. Cincinnati wanted the same future, and they had a unique advantage. An old canal, the Miami and Erie Canal, once ran through the city. By the early 1900s, it was obsolete stagnant water, no longer useful for transportation. But it left behind something valuable, a ready-made path. Instead of digging through solid ground, engineers could build the subway along the canal's route. Easier, cheaper, faster. Construction began in 1920, and it moved quickly. Within 3 years, over 2 miles of tunnels were completed. 4 underground stations were fully built. Additional above-ground stations were in progress. Platforms were ready. Structures were finished. The system wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. And then, everything stopped. Not because of a collapse. Not because of a technical failure. Not because people changed their minds. But because of something far less dramatic. Politics. Money. Timing. World War I had driven up construction costs. The original budget, $6 million, was no longer enough. Estimates now suggested it would take almost double to finish the system. At the same time, leadership changed. A new mayor came into office, Murray Seasongood. He didn't support the subway. In fact, he wanted it stopped. To him, it wasn't a vision. It was a burden left behind by the previous administration. Negotiations dragged on. Funding stalled, decisions delayed, and time kept moving. By the late 1920s, the situation had shifted completely. The stock market crashed. The Great Depression began. Any remaining hope of finishing the subway disappeared. But here's what makes Cincinnati different. They didn't just cancel a plan. They didn't just abandon an idea. They abandoned something that already existed. The tunnels were still there. The stations were still there. Everything they had built remained intact. Instead of completing it, the city chose a different path. They built a road, Central Parkway, a wide boulevard that ran directly above the unfinished subway. Cars replaced trains. Surface replaced underground. And just like that, the project was over, but not gone. Because beneath that parkway, nothing changed. The tunnels didn't collapse. They didn't flood. They didn't decay into uselessness. They stayed exactly as they were. Empty. Platforms waiting for passengers who would never come. Tracks that were never laid. Stations that were never opened. An entire transit system, frozen before its first use. Over time, the city found ways to justify it. In 1948, a local editorial declared the subway pointless. Mass transportation, they argued, was becoming outdated. Streetcars were fading. Cars were the future. The logic made sense for that moment. But here's what doesn't make sense. The tunnels are still usable. Engineers have confirmed it. Structurally sound, capable of lasting another century. In the 1950s, the city even installed a massive water main inside part of the system, not because it was ideal, but because it was cheaper than building a new one. During the Cold War, one of the stations was converted into a nuclear fallout shelter, equipped with supplies, ready for emergency use. So clearly, the space had value, just not the value it was originally built for. Today, the Cincinnati subway is the largest abandoned underground transit system in the United States, and it's still there, maintained, monitored, ignored. Every day, traffic moves above it. Cars fill the roads, congestion builds, and beneath that, a solution already exists. Unused. That's the part that stays with you. This wasn't a failed experiment. This wasn't an impossible dream. This was something people wanted, something they paid for, something they built, and then chose not to use. No disaster forced the decision. No collapse made it necessary. Just a shift in direction. From underground to surface. From shared transit to individual movement. And once that shift happened, there was no going back. Because finishing the subway now would cost more. Maintaining it costs money. Filling it in costs money. So it remains in a strange state. Too valuable to destroy. Too inconvenient to use. Just there. And that's when the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Seattle buried its past. Portland blurred its truth. Cincinnati built something and walked away. Different stories. Different reasons. Same outcome. Something beneath the city. Left behind. But Cincinnati raises a new question. Not about secrecy. Not about crime. About choice. Why does a city invest so much? Only to abandon it? Because if the answer is just circumstance, then it shouldn't happen again. And yet, it does. Which brings us to New York. A city that didn't just build underground systems. It perfected them. And, still, it left some of its most beautiful spaces. Empty. Sealed. Hidden in plain sight. Where millions pass by every day, without ever knowing what's just a few feet away. New York didn't just build underground. It mastered it. By the early 1900s, New York City had already become a symbol of modern infrastructure. The subway system wasn't just functional, it was revolutionary, fast, efficient, expanding. But there was one station that wasn't built just for movement. It was built to impress. City Hall Station. Opened in 1904, it wasn't just another stop on the line. It was the crown jewel of the entire system. Designed by architects who treated it like a monument, not a utility. Curved ceilings made of Guastavino tiles, an intricate architectural technique also used in grand structures like Grand Central Terminal. Brass chandeliers hanging from above. Skylights letting natural sunlight filter down into the station. Tiles arranged in rich colors, red, green, cream, forming patterns that looked more like art than infrastructure. At one point, the station even featured a goldfish pond, a live pianist, paintings on the walls, rugs on the floor. Think about that. A subway station. Designed like a palace. Because at that time, public infrastructure wasn't just about efficiency. It was about identity, pride, a statement that New York had arrived. And for a while, it worked. Passengers moved through it daily. Trains arrived. The system grew. Then, slowly, it became a problem. Not because it failed, not because it broke, but because the world around it changed. Trains got longer. More passengers, more demand. Efficiency became more important than elegance. And City Hall Station had a flaw. Its platform was curved. At first, that wasn't an issue. Early trains were shorter, doors aligned well enough. But as trains expanded, the gap between the platform and the train cars became dangerous. Passengers couldn't board safely. There were solutions. The station could have been redesigned, adjusted, modernized, but it wasn't. Instead, in 1945, City Hall Station was closed. Permanently. No grand farewell. No major announcement. Just a quiet decision. The most beautiful station in New York. Shut down. And here's the part most people don't realize. It's still there. Completely intact. The tiles. The arches. The chandeliers. Even the layout. Nothing was destroyed. Nothing was removed. It was simply left behind. And every day, trains still pass through it. If you stay on the 6th train past its final stop, something you're technically not supposed to do, the train loops around. For a few seconds, it passes through the old City Hall station. And if you're looking out the window at the right moment, you'll see it. A glimpse of another era. Dim light reflecting off curved ceilings. Old chandeliers still hanging in place. An entire space frozen in time, just feet away from the modern world. Then the train turns, and it's gone. Most passengers never notice. Most don't even know to look. That's what makes it different from Seattle. Seattle buried its past. New York didn't. It hid it in plain sight. City Hall Station isn't the only one. There are other abandoned stations across the city. Worth Street closed in 1962. South 4th Street never used at all. The Beach Pneumatic Transit, an experimental underground system from the 1870s, forgotten so completely it had to be rediscovered later. Each one tells the same story. Something built, something functional, something abandoned. Not because it collapsed, not because it failed, but because priorities changed. And when they did, the old structures weren't removed. They were left behind, preserved but inaccessible, visible but unnoticed. New York kept building forward, expanding, modernizing, but it never fully erased what came before. It just layered over it. And that creates something unsettling, because in a city like New York, where space is valuable, where every square foot matters, you don't leave something like that unused, unless there's a reason, or unless the system itself makes it easier to move on than to go back, because redesigning the past is harder than abandoning it. And once again, the pattern repeats. Seattle buried, Portland disputed, Cincinnati abandoned, New York preserved, but sealed. Different methods. Same result. Something beneath the city, left behind, but New York still had one thing. It kept its underground alive. Trains still run. Systems still function. Movement still happens below the surface. Not every city followed that path. Because in Los Angeles, they didn't just abandon the underground, they replaced it. Completely. And what they replaced it with changed everything. When people think of Los Angeles, they think of cars. Endless highways, traffic stretching for miles. A city designed around movement fast, individual, above ground. But that wasn't always true. Before the freeways, Los Angeles had one of the most extensive transit systems in the world. Electric rail lines, thousands of miles of track, streetcars connecting neighborhoods across the entire region. And some of those routes didn't run on the surface. They ran underground. In 1925, Los Angeles opened the Pacific Electric Subway Tunnel, over 4,000 feet long, cutting beneath downtown, saving commuters time about 15 minutes per trip. It was efficient. It worked. People used it. Passengers would descend below the city, board trains, and travel beneath the streets, emerging miles away without ever touching traffic. This wasn't experimental. It wasn't temporary. It was part of a system, and for decades, it functioned. At the same time, another network was forming. Not public, not official. Hidden tunnels beneath downtown. Some connected buildings. Others linked basements. Many were used during Prohibition. Estimates suggest there were hundreds of speakeasies operating in Los Angeles. Illegal bars, hidden behind legitimate businesses. And the tunnels allowed people to move between them without being seen, without stepping outside. You could enter one location and exit somewhere completely different. Police couldn't track movement easily. Raids became harder, even more unsettling. There are records suggesting that corruption ran deep. Some officials knew. Some participated. Certain establishments operated openly protected, not hidden. The King Eddie Saloon, Cole's French Dip, places that, on the surface, appeared normal. But below ground, they were part of something else. A network, movement without visibility, commerce without oversight. Sound familiar? Because by now, the pattern is clear. Underground space changes behavior. It allows things that can't exist above ground to exist below it. But Los Angeles didn't just use its underground. It abandoned it. In the 1950s, everything shifted. Cars became dominant. Highways expanded. Urban planning changed direction. The focus moved upward, outward, faster. Public transit, especially underground transit, was no longer the priority. The rail lines began to disappear. Tracks removed. Routes shut down. Systems dismantled. Even the subway tunnel eventually stopped operating, not because it failed, not because it broke, but because it was no longer needed, or at least that's what they said, because what replaced it was something else entirely. Freeways. Massive, multi-lane highways cutting through the city, designed for cars. Individual movement, not shared space. And once those were built, there was no reason, in their view, to maintain what was below. So they sealed it. The tunnels didn't collapse. They didn't vanish. They were simply closed, left behind beneath a city that redefined itself. Above. Today, most of those underground spaces are inaccessible. Some are blocked. Some are owned privately. Some can only be entered with special permission. But they're still there. Miles of tunnels, old infrastructure, fragments of a system that once moved thousands of people daily, all beneath a city now defined by traffic. And that's the contradiction. Los Angeles struggles with congestion, gridlock, long commute times, and beneath it, there are tunnels, unused, not because they can't be used, but because the city chose a different path, surface over underground, cars over trains, individual over collective, and once that choice was made, everything below became irrelevant, or at least that's how it was treated, because just like Seattle, just like Cincinnati, just like New York, Los Angeles didn't destroy its underground. It left it, and over time, people forgot it was ever there. That's the final step. Not building, not abandoning, forgetting, because once something is out of sight long enough, it stops existing in people's minds, and when that happens, you don't question it. You don't ask what's underneath. You just accept the surface as reality. But by now, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Different cities, different histories, different explanations, but the same outcome: something built, something used, something buried, and eventually, something forgotten. Which brings us to the real question. Not about Seattle, not about Portland, not about Cincinnati, New York, or Los Angeles, but about all of them. Because when the same thing happens, over and over again, it stops being coincidence and starts becoming a pattern, one that suggests something bigger, something intentional, or at the very least, something we were never meant to look too closely at. And that's where this story leads next. Not to another city, but to the pattern itself and what it might mean. At first, each story makes sense on its own. Seattle had a fire. Portland had a dangerous port economy. Cincinnati ran out of money. New York adapted to longer trains. Los Angeles embraced cars. Individually, these are logical explanations. Reasonable, even expected. But when you place them side by side, something changes. Because the outcome is always the same. Something gets built. Something gets used. And then it gets abandoned, sealed, or buried. Not destroyed. Not erased completely. Just removed from everyday life. That's the part that doesn't fit. Because if something is useless, you demolish it. If it's dangerous, you eliminate it. If it's outdated, you replace it. But in these cases, they didn't. They left everything in place. Seattle's underground still exists. Portland's tunnels still connect buildings. Cincinnati's subway is still structurally sound. New York's abandoned stations remain intact. Los Angeles still has miles of sealed passages. Different cities. Same decision. Leave it. Hide it. Move on. And that raises a question that none of the official explanations really address. Why keep it at all? Because maintaining something you don't use costs money. Cincinnati spends millions just to keep its tunnels stable. New York maintains abandoned stations beneath active lines. Los Angeles monitors underground spaces that no longer serve any purpose. So clearly, these places aren't being ignored. They're being managed, quietly, which means they still matter, just not in a way the public sees. And this is where the timeline becomes important. Most of these changes happened between 1890 and 1950, a period of massive transformation in American cities. Think about what changed during that time. Horse-drawn transport automobiles, dense, walkable streets, wide highways, public transit private vehicles, shared urban space segmented infrastructure. Cities didn't just evolve, they shifted direction, and that shift had consequences. Underground systems, subways, tunnels, interconnected networks were built for one kind of city, a connected city, a city designed around shared movement. But the new model didn't need that. It prioritized speed, individual control, surface-level expansion, and once that model took over, everything built for the previous one became obsolete. Not broken, not flawed, just incompatible. So instead of redesigning those systems, they were left behind, buried beneath the new version of the city, layered over. And over time, something else happened. The narrative changed. These places stopped being seen as infrastructure. They became historical curiosities, abandoned spaces, urban legends. Something interesting, but not important. And that shift matters. Because once something is framed as a curiosity, people stop questioning it. They don't ask why it was abandoned. They don't ask if it could still be used. They don't ask what decisions led to that outcome. They just accept it and move on. But the pattern doesn't go away. It keeps repeating. Different cities, different decades, same structure. Build something significant. Use it briefly. Abandon it quickly. Preserve it silently. Forget it completely. And the speed of that cycle is what's most unsettling. Seattle's underground was active for less than 2 decades before being sealed. Cincinnati's subway never opened at all. New York's City Hall station lasted just over 40 years. These aren't ancient ruins. These are modern structures, built within reach of living memory. And yet, they've already been pushed into the past. That shouldn't happen this fast, unless forgetting is part of the process. And that leads to the final question, not about any single city, but about all of them. If this much can be built, used, and forgotten within a century, what else might be beneath us that we've never even been told about? Because the deeper you look into these stories, the clearer one thing becomes. The surface isn't the full story. It never was. And whatever lies beneath it isn't always meant to be seen. Which brings us to the final piece. Not the history, not the cities, but what all of this actually means. Because once you recognize the pattern, you can't ignore it, and you definitely can't unsee it. By now, the pattern is clear. Cities don't just grow, they replace themselves, layer by layer, decision by decision, and every time that happens, something gets left behind. Not destroyed, not erased, just pushed out of sight. Seattle buried an entire district. Portland blurred the truth about what lay beneath. Cincinnati walked away from a finished system. New York sealed away beauty in the name of efficiency. Los Angeles abandoned everything underground in favor of what was above. Different stories, same ending. And that forces a question most people never ask. Not what happened, but why it keeps happening. Because once is an accident, twice is coincidence. But this is a pattern. And patterns don't form randomly. They form because something is guiding them. Not necessarily a conspiracy, not necessarily a hidden plan, but a direction, a shift in how cities and people choose to live. Between 1890 and 1950, something fundamental changed. The way cities were built, the way people moved, the way space was used. Before that shift, cities were dense, connected, designed for shared movement. Underground systems made sense. They linked spaces. They allowed flow without interruption. They made the city feel unified. After that shift, cities spread outward. Movement became individual. Infrastructure moved to the surface. Highways replaced rail lines. Distance replaced density. And the underground? It didn't fit anymore. Not because it stopped working. Not because it lost value. But because it belonged to a different version of the city. So instead of adapting it, Cities abandoned it. And that's the key. This wasn't about failure. It was about replacement. One system overtook another, and the older system was left where it stood, buried beneath the new one. But here's what makes that unsettling. Because those systems, the ones we abandoned, were built to last. Look at them. Seattle's underground is still structurally intact. Cincinnati's subway could still function. New York's sealed stations remain preserved. Los Angeles still has miles of tunnels beneath its streets. These weren't temporary solutions. They were long-term infrastructure. And yet, they were treated as disposable. Not because they broke, but because priorities changed. And that raises another question. If something that significant, something that expensive, something that functional, can be abandoned that easily, what else can be? Because cities are built on decisions, and those decisions don't just shape the future. They determine what gets remembered, and what gets forgotten. And forgetting is powerful, because once something is forgotten, it stops being questioned, it stops being considered, it stops existing in any meaningful way, until someone looks again. And that's the point of all of this. Not to prove a conspiracy, not to suggest something hidden is controlling everything, but to show you something simple. You are not seeing the full version of the world around you. No one is. Because what we call a city is just the latest version, the surface, and beneath it, there are layers, older versions, older systems, older decisions, still there, not gone, just out of sight. And once you understand that, everything changes. Every street you walk down might have another one beneath it. Every building might be sitting on top of something that used to matter just as much. Every city might be hiding more than it shows. So the next time you're walking through one, pause for a second, look down, because the ground beneath you might not be what you think it is, and the version of the city you see might not be the first one, or even the most important one. It's just the one you were meant to notice.